Pulitzer and Hearst, they think we're nothing. Are we nothing?
We'll do what we gotta do until we break the will of Mighty Bill and Joe.
And the world will know. And the journal too.
The year is 1899. The scene is New York City. A group of boys stand on street corners. Normally those boys would be hawking newspapers, calling headlines, but today, July 20th, the Manhattan Newsboys are on strike. The Newsboys' strike of 1899 was an event involving both rights and responsibilities that affected history. The Newsies went on strike to fight for their rights as working children, but had to balance the responsibilities of nonviolence and unity. They affected history by inspiring other strikes and becoming national icons. The whole ordeal started back in 1898 when the battleship Maine in Havana Harbor sunk on February 15th. On April 25, 1898, the United States declared war on Spain, and the Spanish-American War began. It was known as the First Media War. Newspapers sensationalized events and helped lead America into the war. William Randolph Hearst, owner of the New York Journal, and Joseph Pulitzer, owner of the New York World, were at the head of the media craze with their yellow journalism, which was the technique of using melodramatic news and headlines to sell papers better. It was named after a yellow-dressed kid in a comic in both papers. Journalists from both papers wrote wild stories about Cuban executions, rebel fights, starving children, and poor treatment of female prisoners. Hearst even blamed the sinking of the battleship Maine on the Spanish with no validated evidence to back it up. Pulitzer and Hearst made Americans hate the Spanish, and the more Americans hated the Spanish, the more they bought papers. To take advantage of the situation, Pulitzer and Hearst, like many of the other newspapers, bumped their prices up to sell to their deliverers from 50 cents to 60 cents per 100 papers. The sensational headlines sold, and the newspapers made a huge profit. When the war ended on December 10, 1898, most of the papers dropped the prices back down, all except two, Hearst Journal and Pulitzer's World. Joseph Pulitzer was born in 1847 in Hungary. He served 1 year in the Lincoln Cavalry after being enlisted as a substitute for a draftee by a bounty recruiter for the U.S. Union Army. After building a reputation as an ambitious journalist, he acquired the hugely popular World. The World was the largest circulating paper in the country. William Randolph Hearst was born in 1863 in San Francisco. He acquired many newspapers as an adult, including the Morning Journal.
So how you got these newspapers out is that you hired people to sell them on the streets, to stand on street corners and
to hawk them.
To shout out the headlines. And of course, because this was not a great job, it sort of went to the lowest rung of society at this point, which was poor children. And so this is how the newsie comes to be. If you were a standard newsboy, you would go down at crack of dawn. You would go down to Printing House Square. What they would do, for 50 cents, they would go and they would get 100 newspapers. They would have to go out to the corners and they would have to sell every one of those newspapers. And they only made a profit if they sold over a certain amount. So say like, if it was 100 papers, they made a profit if they sold over 60. Now, of course, the problem with that is, of course, sometimes you didn't sell them all and you were just stuck with them. And so,
or it was a slow news day and people didn't care.
Throughout the 1890s, more than 100,000 children were homeless. With few social services available, the children lived on the streets. The majority of them were orphaned immigrants. Newsboys and the few newsgirls were among the child labor force and had no rights. They were a vital part of the newspaper industry, but they got very little for it. Sometimes they had enough to pay for lodging and food, but other times they had to live on the street and beg for food.
They were usually young, underage kids. The life for these boys on the street in the turn of the century in New York City, it was not a pleasant one. I think it's hard for us to even understand today what the quality or the lack thereof was like for these children.
Many newsboys couldn't afford to pay for the papers once the sensational headlines stopped, and those that did found that they were often shorted on their papers. It was time to fight for their rights.
One thing for sure, if we don't sell papes, then nobody sells papes. Nobody comes through those gates till they put the price back where it was.
What do you mean, like a strike?
Yeah, like a strike.
On July 19th, the Manhattan Newsies gathered in City Hall Park to discuss striking, but it wasn't until the next day that the strike started. The Manhattan Newsies had to band together. It was their responsibility to help each other so they could get their rights. The next day, the boys refused to sell the Evening Journal and World, but sold all the other papers. New Yorkers could still get the World and Journal from newsstands, just not from the Newsies, so the strike started off as just an inconvenience. The newsboys started attacking delivery wagons and scabs that day. Many citizens condemned their violence. At this point, the public viewed the newsboys as just dirty, homeless urchins, and they disliked the strike interrupting their daily routines. By the second day of the strike, it stretched from the Battery to the Bronx. On July 22nd, many boys were arrested for their disturbances throughout the day. They held parades up and down streets, and whenever they saw copies of the Journal or the World, they ripped them. Other newspapers took advantage of the World's and Journal's weakness. They covered the strike and took over the circulation. The press from the other papers also helped the Newsboys. As the public learned about the Newsboys' crusade, many stopped buying the World and Journal papers to support the Newsboys. The World and Journal circulation dropped from 360,000 to 125,000, or to about one-third of its previous circulation, and public pressure on Hearst and Pulitzer increased. On the 5th day of the strike, the World and Journal advertised for grown men to sell their papers for $2 a day. Newspapers were losing too much money and needed to sell their papers again. It didn't matter to them who was hawking the headlines. The Newsboys responded by attacking the men and shredding their papers. Something had to be done to stop the violence. So on the night of July 24th, a meeting was arranged in New Irving Hall. Even the meeting appeared violent, with 5,000 newsboys swarming the hall. All of the newsboy leaders, including the once pro-violence Kid Bling, called for non-violence. He realized that the best way to be taken seriously was a peaceful strike. The boys wanted to get their rights, and if they weren't peaceful, they didn't deserve their rights. After the meeting, violence decreased, but now they needed to figure out how to work as a team. 1 year earlier, in 1898, the boroughs of New York joined the city. The city had just gotten bigger, filled with more newsboys. In previous attempted strikes, newsboys had never gotten what they wanted because they were fighting each other. But with more newsboys at their disposal and on their side, it was possible for the newsies to really put a dent in the World's and Journal's circulation, if they could only work together. As homeless urchins on the street, newsies were used to living on their own and only looking out for themselves. It would be much harder for the boys to all come together. On the 3rd day of the strike, Crazy Arborn, one of the more prosperous newsboys, bought 1,500 pretzels for the newsies during a rally with his own hard-earned money. That one act from even a prosperous newsboy showed how he was willing to give what he had to keep everyone together. Leaders like Kid Blink, Dave Simmons, and Racetrack Higgins also rose to bring all the newsies together. They made speeches and held rallies. By working together, the newsboys were able to send a message to Pulitzer and Hearst by lowering their circulation. The newspaper giants were becoming extremely desperate now. They needed advertisers to fund their paper and their paychecks, but with no circulation, they couldn't sell any ads. Another issue the boys had was that they needed to be able to respect adults enough to work with them. Almost all of the newsies grew up raising themselves, and they had little or no respect for adults. However, a strike run by just kids was much less effective against the newspaper giants. The Newsdealers and Stationers Association was an organization accepted by other adults, as it was run by the adults who worked at newsstands and distributed newspapers. Seeing all the newsboys fulfilling their responsibilities by working together and being nonviolent, the Newsdealers and Stationers Association decided that they would fight for the newsboys' rights. At a meeting, 50-year-old James Neal, a newsman who sold papers from a stand at the Brooklyn Bridge, was elected as president of the Newsboy Union to help the boys achieve their goals of lowering the newspaper's price. But the kids wouldn't hand over all their power to the adults. They elected Racetrack Higgins, a Brooklyn newsie, to be the vice president. Across the state and in New Jersey, newsboys were supporting the cause. From Staten Island to Mount Vernon to Trenton, all the boys were striking the World and Journal. The New York City newsboys had become more than just strikers. They had become icons. People all over the country looked to the boys as an inspiration. With the adults' help and the overwhelming public support for the newsies, Pulitzer and Hearst had reached their breaking points. The Newsboys had practically brought the two biggest newspapers' distributions to a halt. Pulitzer and Hearst offered the boys 55 cents per hundred instead of the current 60 cents per hundred papers, but the boys denied. They wanted the pre-war price of 50 cents. 2 weeks after the strike started, August 2, 1899, Pulitzer and Hearst offered the newsies a deal. Instead of lowering the price, the papers offered to buy back any unsold papers. The boys took the deal. Instead of losing all the money they spent on papers they couldn't sell, they could just return them. So they had to pay more for the papers in the beginning, but they saved more in the end. The Newsboys fulfilled their responsibilities in nonviolence and unity, and they were able to achieve the rights they wanted. Once the strike ended, the boys went back to selling the papers. But now the big newspapers knew that they could no longer take advantage of the newsboys and that the newsies deserved their rights. The newsboys played a large part in the path to achieving rights for child labor. The boys fought for their rights, inspiring later strikes like the Butte, Montana Newsboys strike of 1914, a 1920 strike in Louisville, Kentucky, and many others by showing the kids in those towns that anyone's voice can be heard. The strategy of the Newsboys to use their responsibilities of nonviolence and unity set a blueprint for those other strikes to take place. Without the Newsboys strike of 1899 as an inspiration and a striking model to follow, those other strikes may never have happened. To this day, the influence of the Newsies still holds with the 1992 Disney film Newsies and a current Broadway show of the same name.
I think it was really inspiring for kids to watch these children in this movie stand up for themselves and fight for justice for themselves.
The story of underprivileged underdogs taking on newspaper giants and winning is one that inspires people today to fight for their own rights and follow their responsibilities.